Thank you for the recording. So we'll just do a confirmation of the agenda for today. So we'll be starting off with our usual business, confirmation of minutes and updates on actions from previous meetings, and then any other updates that anybody needs to raise for today. And then it looks like we've got 2 items here from Andy for additional features prioritization and the AU eRequesting DI mapping and IG design principles. And then we'll close out with some details on the next meeting. So there's a couple of people here from Spark, CSIRO, and some of the other major partners here today as well. So if anybody needs anything, just pop your questions in the chat and they will be answered for as possible. Andy, are you okay with the times for today? Is there anything else that you need at the moment for your 2 items that we have here?
Ooh. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Excellent. So just flat white things. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I'm all right, good to go.
Cool, perfect. So there will be no approval of minutes of the previous meeting today. We're going to hold those over till the meeting on the 30th. They're not quite ready for today's meeting, so we'll get those done on the next meeting. And then there is also, we'll just let you know that the next meeting is not on the 25th because that will be Anzac Day. So we'll be holding it over till the 30th, and then we'll go into that at the end of the meeting as well. Updates on the actions from the previous meetings. Sorry. So we'll be deferring minutes until our next regular meeting, and then we have actions from the last. So we have Michael Wilson will be populating the release column and email TDG. I believe that one has been marked as complete already. Michael, if there's any updates that you need from that one.
No, it's done. That's done.
Perfect. Thank you. Andy, to add patient centricity principle to the eRequesting IG design principles. Andy, also to... Sorry, go on.
No. I haven't done it yet.
Cool, no worries. Andy, again, to incorporate principles on solving existence problems, not creating new problems to the eRequesting IG design principles.
Yeah, it's on my plan.
Cool. Danielle, send an email summary to all meeting attendees with a link to the eRequesting principles table for feedback and contributions. I think I saw something about that, but I might be confusing with a different email.
Different email.
Cool.
Yeah, I do need to send that out. I'll try and send that out today. If not today, it'll be tomorrow. Yeah, I'll get that done this week.
Perfect. And then Kylan to make visible CDG principles in an easy to find format / e.g. on a website. Kylan here?
Yeah, I've checked in with her because she's not at this one at the moment. She's got a separate meeting, and she said that yep, still on track for that due date time, but it's not available yet.
Perfect. And then anybody that doesn't know, all these action items are tracked over on the Confluence pages for the TDG meetings as well. So you can keep an eye on them there. All the links and everything will be updated and they're marked off as complete when that's sort of done. So we can keep an eye on it through the Confluence pages. If there's anybody that doesn't know where to find any of that, just put it in the chat and we'll get those links out to you guys as well. Next up, we've got the additional features prioritization, which is Andy Bond. Andy, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so hopefully there is more voting that has occurred. Stuart, can you flick up the features page, or do you want me to?
That's all right. Let me bring that over for you. Should be this one. Yell out if it's not.
Yep, that's on.
Cool.
No, that's design principles. It's the other one.
The other one. Have you got that handy there?
I do.
You could click on the slide. That should take you through.
I was just going to say I could just click on the slide, couldn't I? That would be much easier. There we go. That's better. See that okay?
Yes. We do have an overwhelming winner, which is good to see that requesting groups is there as the front runner. There's also been some questions around groups and the role of groups. This is actually a pretty fundamental issue that we kind of are going to have to get under our belt sooner rather than later. And this is in many ways because in FHIR, the building block for a request is actually an individual test or procedure request. It is not a group of tests. It is the one, and therefore we need some way of grouping them together to represent what is our more traditional way of, paper-based ordering or others where we have a sequence of things that we're requesting to be done. And so how do we deal with them as a whole rather than deal with them in isolation? We actually want both, but deciding upon the rules around treating them as a whole versus treating them individually gets more and more complex as you, I think, dig away at that issue. Some people have asked around whether these groups are actually the SPHIR codes themselves. And that's an interesting question, given there is use of codes to be a group itself. So it's a suite of tests that are coded as a single entity. That's a bit of a parallel universe to this. This is about a way of taking a series of individual tests, liver function tests, full blood count, and having them referenceable as a whole within a request. And this, I think in our data mapping exercises we'll get to in a moment, has introduced some confusion, I think mainly because of the wording that we talk about a service request, we talk about requesting, and then we've got the whole concept of orders and ordering, and whether we're talking about the individual or the set can get quite confusing. I think this will become clearer as we process this highest priority feature issue, and we need to talk about both the concept of a group of fulfillments. So if you as a filler are providing the services for a series of requests, then can we represent the state and the meaning associated with the fulfillment of multiple things as opposed to the fulfillment of an individual element? And then there's also the concept of a group of requests. So as we've previously talked about, requests and fulfillment are two parallel concepts that link together in that. So Danielle, I don't know how easy it is, but I'm not expecting you to do this every time, but if there are obvious priorities that are emerging, it may be useful to put the higher priority ones up the top.
Yeah, I reckon we can attempt that admin before each meeting. So just like the day before or something, do a quick scan of it and try and reorder the rows. I mean, it's manual, but it's not that difficult at this point.
Yeah, I don't even know if you need to do it before every meeting. It's just after a couple of weeks, it becomes more obvious. And please, by all means, if you still haven't looked at this or haven't made comment, then do. I'll also, over the next few days, try to put some commentary as to some of the comments that have been raised, just to give some clarity. Question, Tawinda.
Yeah, Andy, I have seen some GP system, they are creating multiple tests, but they can't differentiate in their system whether the request is raised for 2 tests or 3 tests. And this can create only one service request and one task because there's no way of differentiating it. So in that scenario, should we still create request group and the group task?
So what we're going to, yes, is the answer. We need to determine a way forward on this, at least as a draft for evaluation and adoption. I have in the past gone down the road of request groups. I'm at the moment more inclined to suggest that we look at a simpler mechanism, which would just simply be a request list. And the reasoning why we need a request list and a task group does need to come out in a discussion. And I think we need to put this on the agenda for one of the earliest feature discussions in the next couple of weeks, because it is going to be difficult for us to qualify some of the other data features until we have at least kind of made a way forward for grouping.
So our next meeting's on the 30th, which is in 2 weeks. So is that about the right time frame, or is that still too early?
No, I'd be happy to present on that date on the grouping options and the implications of those options. Yeah, unless there's anyone, I don't know whether you would. I don't know if it's that controversial that you would need a great deal of pondering time beforehand, but this wouldn't be a decision that was forever kind of set in stone. It would be simply an agreement collaboratively we come up with to say this would be our draft position moving forward, and we can then define relative to that. It would hopefully answer some of the other questions that have been popping up. Does anyone have any other comments on whether they think that that's too early or don't see that as an appropriate thing to do in 2 weeks' time?
I think it's kind of fundamental to moving forward in some way. So it's a core piece that we need to work through. So I think it's worth doing sooner. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll add that to my obligations for 2 weeks to create something to agree on a position at that meeting about representing both request groups and task groups.
I'll just say, sorry, on that topic before David comments, is also if we're keeping to our proposed meeting cadence, which is a following kind of which is a meeting the following week, we can also revisit that, I guess, or any further feedback or refinement after we've gone through the proposal as well. So I'm pretty keen to talk about it on April 30. And scheduling that follow on potentially.
Yeah, I'm sorry, David, before we're going on that. The things that we are implementing here, are we progressing on the scaffold implementation guide? Should we use that one or expecting that to be updated, or there's a new implementation guide will come up?
I think when we agree on a position, we'll put that into the scaffold as a draft way forward, so you can see what's being proposed. If I get enthusiastic, I'll have that added in time for the meeting, so you can have a look and see what the representations are possible. That there is kind of 2 pathways we can take around at least the request groups. So I'll talk through both of those options at that point. But yes, it will come out of the scaffold.
Thank you.
David.
I do support investigating this early. I think it could have potential impacts on customer experience and how patients actually deal with the requests that they might have in a wallet or by email or by text. We certainly don't want to be splitting things up.
I think it's a very pragmatic yes thing to decide. There's another couple of I'm just kind of casting my eye over the set that's there. There is does anyone want to raise in this forum any of the commentary that was put in there? Matt, you've been quite vociferous in your commentary.
Oh, I just put comments because if I didn't do it while I was looking the other day, I'd forget about it. So
good call.
I think some of them, I talked to Colin about that I think the wording for those features in that now is still a bit vague, because I think it's just probably what came out of those workshops. Like particularly going back to that grouping one, just a bit more meat around exactly what we're talking about. Some of them are pretty clear, I think, like the Rule 3 stuff, but the grouping, like as you said, there's a few different ways you could interpret that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and certainly the what we were trying to do is use these as a starting point for a conversation, and you have reminded me that we do need to call out the different grouping approaches that are taken, and how grouping is not just done in one place, it's actually done in multiple places, and what the implications of those groups mechanisms are and how they will work together. So it's well called out and worth noting. Anyone else? Alrighty, so we might at this point, Stuart, can you move on to the principal page if you've got that?
Sure thing. All right. You just want that second one, the IG design principles?
Yeah.
Yeah, no problem.
This is more just a reminder to everyone to say that we have started some principles. We had a bit of a discussion about this last time. There was some commentary that we should look at principles for how we might decide around scope and things that we decide should be in or should be out of the domain of work that we're doing. And we will work on that. There was the meeting was only last Thursday, I think. So there's a couple of additional principles that we talked about that I will look to draft something up over the next week or so. But again, if you weren't there last time and you have some input to make to these, please add some commentary or something. These will be used as a way of reflecting on the conversations we have, and to ensure that some of the features that the decisions we make exhibit are actually in line with the broader picture that we're trying to follow. Anyone have any commentary on that? No. Okay. Is there one more? No, there's just a comment. Can we go to the data mapping? Data model mapping.
Yep, no problem. Let's see if we can get this all into it.
Excellent. So we started with this rough kind of picture of the model as we are looking to build out the constraints around which our IG attributes and IG is going to be developed. And in particular, it's obviously taken into account the AU CDI input, as well as some of the operational aspects of supporting requesting. If you scroll down a bit to the beginning of the mapping, keep going. Yeah, stop here. So last week we talked about this generic service request data group. And I think, and I probably didn't hone in on this last time, but I think everyone needs to be aware that the name service request is a bit of an overloaded term from a FHIR perspective as well, potentially a data group perspective. From a FHIR perspective, service request is a request for a service. It's not a request for multiple services. Now, as Matt pointed out, it certainly is possible to code a opaque set of services within a single entity and call that a single service request. But in general, the FHIR foundation is a single test, say from a pathology perspective, would be represented within a single service request. So you can't directly equate a service request from FHIR with, for instance, a paper diagnostic request form. Has anyone got any questions about that? Because I think it's pretty fundamental. It's not saying we're not supporting the grouping of a set of tests to represent something like a pathology request form. It's just saying the FHIR building block that we've been talking about in these FHIR resources does not, out of the box, support that. Danielle.
Hey, Mitch, I think I'm really just going to comment further that I 100% agree. Of a lot of the use cases out there in terms of ordering, we're not going to find this one-to-one, really, from representing the paper or the real world concepts coming into this nice, there's one FHIR resource, there's one element. That's just really not what's going to be happening. And I want to stress that. So we are going to be, we'll end up using these data model mappings, but I guess a lot more of that will be the conversations we have in these meetings, and will end up being represented through, I guess, the scaffold IG and the other things we're working up, or through the additional features on how does that really look like in a FHIR space.
And call out to Chris for doing a sterling effort. I'm assuming it's Chris of putting all of the use case references in there. Hopefully, if you do have some questions around what this means in terms of kind of the real world, then that should give you some context in which to reference some of this stuff. So last time we went through the code, the category, the clinical indication, the basic building blocks that give the context for that service request. You are likely to begin to ask questions about whether these individual service request attributes are relevant to an individual test or a group of tests. So for instance, does it make sense to have multiple service request categories within a single order, for instance? I think we should hold that question over to when we're talking about the groups, because that grouping concept has a lot of implications for how we represent the status of the pieces, and whether the group itself has a life of its own, or is the group and the pieces inextricably bound together in terms of the data that they represent. So if we can kind of pretend we understand all that for the minute, and if you scroll down a little bit till we get to that, I think we finished off generic. Yeah, so if you just get up to just before we get to pathology. So I think we talked about most of these. Does anyone have an issue with us at this point creating in the scaffold a draft approach? This is not the consensus we've all agreed, you can never change your mind again, but simply a draft approach around which we can then discuss the details of these FHIR elements representing the reference data elements.
Yes, that sounds like a great idea.
Happy with that?
Was that you, Michael?
Yes, it was.
Anyone else? Oh, I got 2 votes. Okay. Well, we shall proceed on that basis that we begin then to populate the scaffold with some of these concepts. Very happy for there to be questions about the approaches we take. They will introduce more questions, I think, around some of the value sets that we need to adopt to support them, but it will give us a starting point for a deeper discussion. Okay, if you would like, Stuart, to scroll down to pathology. Now, there will be service request attributes that are going to be specific for pathology, and there's likely to be service request elements that will be specific for radiology requests. What we would tend to do is to say, is to have a base service request that would support all of diagnostic service requests, and then specialize that into a pathology branch and a radiology requesting branch if there is attributes which are specific to those different domains. So that is, I think, the logic by which we would likely do this separation. So if we begin to talk about pathology first up, we have started off looking at, obviously, category being related to a pathology laboratory category of service request. But at first, I guess one of significance is fasting status. The way this is, there is an existing extension that exists within FHIR, which is a precondition for a service request, indicating that this condition is required to be met before the service request can be fulfilled. And in this case, fasting status is a likely candidate for such an attribute. I don't know if anyone has any ideas about others, but that's certainly the most obvious in terms of the standard requesting approach. Do you have any commentary on that? Any other suggestions?
I was just thinking, for fasting status, is that collected at the, recorded at the time of collection rather than the request? Because the request might be for a fasting glucose, and then when they present at the collection centre, they mark whether the patient actually did what they were supposed to.
Yeah, so this would be, I think it should be an indication that's included in the request itself. And so it would be a precondition that could then be interpreted by, say, for instance, a patient accessing the request to going, what is the set of preconditions then I would have to meet in order to fulfill it? And not that they're going to be reading native FHIR, but if a system was going to interpret it for the patient, they would then not be reliant upon an interpretation of the test codes themselves to determine the fasting status requirement. I think there would be something that would be recorded within the collection center as well, to say that there was a request for fasting, and we questioned the patient, and the patient either did or didn't fast, and then that would be recorded within the collection center's data set. That's just my uninformed observation. Does that sound reasonable?
Andy, when you said that result of whether they fasted or not is recorded in the collection center's data set, is that something that's fed back into this request, or is it something that comes back with the report? So you've got the fasting status is a precondition. You must fast. It's like an instruction to the patient. But whether they fasted or not is a piece of data that you collect. Do we want to collect that back in the service request, or does that come back in the test results?
Usually they tell you just to come back another time after you've fasted, don't they?
Yeah, one of the pathologists might like to comment on that. Ken?
Certainly when I hadn't fasted, they told me to come back another day.
Yeah. Okay.
You idiot, go away.
That's right.
Alternatively,
It doesn't
something
always
you would
happen that
report.
way. There are some tests that will be accepted without fasting. They'll just make note of it and adjust the expectant ranges accordingly.
Right.
Yeah, that's the point, is that the test may have a reference limit that's appropriate to fasting. But then the question is whether the request is for a fasting glucose, which has its appropriate reference interval, or the test is for a glucose whose precondition may be fasting or not. And then the precondition determines the reference interval as well. And that's, in a way, a more awkward way to go around it. But I wouldn't exclude imaging from this, because you do have to fast for some imaging tests as well, like barium, esophageal swallows or whatever. So it's
a good point.
It's an issue of whether the test, the SNOMED coding for testing, which currently may not include that. I'm not actually sure with glucose whether there's a different SNOMED code for fasting glucose or random glucose, but the precondition may be in the test. And that would be a more convenient way for both the requesting and the laboratory to cope with it, but to have another field which determines how to interpret the test. Anyway, but there may be other issues that, like I said, the supine standing, or there may be other preconditions which might be handy to have there, but I'm not sure whether they're going to be hard coded or just comments.
And would they be on the service request or on the request group?
Well, that's this issue about grouping is really awkward, because like somebody raised in the chat, there's no such thing as a fasting FBE or a random FBE. The FBE just adopts the property of that collection. There's no difference. So whether the condition applies to all tests in the group or only to a specific test in the group is an important issue. And so, it is a grouping issue. And we do have this to follow testing. So a patient, like you say, a patient may turn up, the doctor wanted a fasting glucose and insulin, but you're not fasting. Well, we'll take all the other tests, but you can come back and give us the sample for that. But then it doesn't apply to the other tests in the group. So grouping is sort of, we have to be very rigorous in the grouping to make sure that as soon as a patient has a different collection episode, the grouping has to allow for that. So it's a good idea, Andy, to really chat about this and see how much we gain from preconditions and how much we complicate the issue. Sorry, I've just come back from a meeting, so I was sort of watching what was happening. And and I think that the grouping is an important point. You also were talking about, because a request can be directed to somebody. So is it only the test? Is the grouping? Does the grouping also for the purpose of who it's directed to? And the doctor may specifically say, I want this test, which you can do, to be sent to another provider. So, the best way to manage all of that is to have tests and then group them when all of those things, preconditions, fulfiller, everything match, they can be grouped. But as soon as you start grouping things that may have different preconditions or different fulfillers, then we're going to start to run into problems.
Yeah, as you say, it is complex, and we also have there's two different things here at play too. There's the request, and then there's the fulfillment. So the request is, how do we bind appropriate information into the request and the overarching request group that it covers, that's covering those individual tests. And then there's other information associated with the fulfillment and the group and individual fulfillments that occur. Michael.
Yeah, I think you pretty much just made the point I was going to make, but I think predominantly what we're looking at here in the service request is the placer, the preconditions that the placer has identified for the test, and then the patient can, like you indicated, could be used for identifying that they need to fast before the test. But I don't think we're talking about that scope for the filler, about all that extra information that's collected by the filler and done during the processing of the test. That I don't think we're really talking about that scope, which I think was probably David's original question, but may or may not be. I think David's got his hand up.
I was thinking maybe fasting instruction is a better word, and then that really clearly differentiates it from any data collected about fasting.
I completely agree. That was pretty much my point as well. The fasting status is actually throwing us, I think, here. It is not a status. It is an instruction or condition that basically the placer is saying you must fast. And then for the filler's perspective, they need to double check that they have fasted. And it's a little bit of an extra step over and above. Like with our test code, we would have said we wanted a fasting glucose test, for example. But this is the extra instruction to the patient and to the collector that they need to make sure that they have fasted. So fasting instruction is a good term, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think you're right. The fasting status is a bit of a confusing thing. I think it's very interesting that, and I don't know, Matt or someone, in terms of terminology, this issue where that fasting instruction is bound to the code or the service or test, versus when it's not, and whether both of those situations need to be allowed for.
Yeah, I think the spare set, I'm pretty sure, has fasting and random variants for the glucose and I think triglycerides from memory, but don't come down to me if I forgot that wrong. But so I kind of wonder this fasting instruction, if that applies to the whole request, if it's already embedded in the specific codes where it's relevant, as Dr. Scara said about the reference intervals are dependent on this. That's really where it's used.
Yeah, I was just looking, Stephen Chu in the comments talked about imaging also potentially requiring fasting, and whether that gets bound within the coding or not. Marvin.
So the question that was raised before about putting the indications, for example, or letting people know the appropriate reference ranges for a test once it's completed. If the test is for a fasting glucose and the person hasn't fasted and we send back a response and we put back, alternate reference ranges because the person didn't fast, is that appropriate? And I'm asking the pathology people on the call, is that a common way of dealing with that, as opposed to if it wasn't put on and the instruction was to fast but they didn't? I don't know whether the test can actually be completed if it's a fasting glucose test and they haven't fasted, or whether it's something that they need to come back and do.
Yeah, I mean, labs will cope with that differently. So at the moment, in a lot of the community labs, the samples are collected by general practice clinics, maybe 30, 40% of them, and they may collect a sample because they're not as trained as our staff. They may collect a sample that is not fasting, but the doctor asks for a fasting test. Now, the laboratory has a number of ways of doing this. They can take the doctor asked for fasting, so we'll just put a comment on the fasting result to say that the patient wasn't actually fasting. Or the laboratory may say, well, you've asked for a fasting glucose, but the patient wasn't fasting, so we'll change that SNOMED code to a random glucose and import it as if it was a random glucose. So at the moment, the labs do it whichever way they want to, and really, I suppose that's reassuring because it means that whatever we do here, the labs will have ways of coping with the noise that's coming in anyway. Yeah. But it'd be, yeah, it's. I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to be drilling into this because I know too much with my age and everything, but every test is affected by fasting. When you're fasting, most patients are dehydrated, so all the results are higher. So fasting anything is higher than a random anything. So, so that's the issue about when you say, well, this was a test for a fasting hemoglobin, which is not affected by fasting, but you told me that they were fasting, so maybe I should be treating it differently. Whereas if I don't know, yeah, so it's don't. I think, look, what we're saying about the fasting precondition, like, you know, the doctor asked them to fast and he ordered a fasting glucose. So hopefully those two things will coincide. But if he's asked them to fast and they presented without collection, and we have instructions, because if the doctor asks for that test urgently, we're not going to tell the patient, go away and come back tomorrow when you're fasting. We're going to take the random glucose. So laboratories cope with that scenario at the moment, but I think it's important to say that it's a precondition on, well, this is the issue that we have to solve with the grouping. Is it a precondition on the group or the precondition on the individual test?
Yeah.
Yeah. Daniel.
Just a little comment on the idea of using SNOMED codes that embed additional constraints or information. What we don't want to end up with is a situation where the code in the request and the code that's returned in the task are different from each other because preconditions are not met. So just a little warning there. The way we address things, I'm more supportive of the idea of the intention being indicated in the request in a separate field than actually trying to create one SNOMED code that controls everything and that ends up then being broken in the task. Just a comment.
That's a good point. And I think there is that kind of link, obviously, from the request and the report. And we, at the moment, the scope we're dealing with is the requests alone, not the report. So what may or may not be documented from a collection center and pathology perspective is not necessarily constrained by what we're defining within this requesting IG. Tawinda.
I have my request form in front, and my doctor does mention fasting glucose, but he didn't select any precondition on fasting. How that instruction goes? Do we need to pass this fasting precondition as false here, or we don't pass any precondition in the end, but still the test goes as fasting glucose?
Well, personally, I don't think we would all say it's false. We would simply just not include it because no information was provided. And then, you know, we obviously, I think, are going to have to document around fasting precondition that, you know, that if this data is included, it's indicative of fasting being a precondition for. Now, as Ken said, whether we're talking about the group or talking about the individual test, if nothing is said, then it's not saying that fasting is not required. It is simply leaving it unstated.
And is it going to be some SNOMED code or just a Boolean?
I believe, well, I can't remember now. Someone else may know. It's been a while. I believe it's simply a Boolean within the extension. Danielle?
I think I just really wanted to echo that point that got picked up there on if that value is not included, that's not stating a negative. That means that information is, it's not being carried through. Basically, it doesn't have that information. And I think that's something that is true for all the elements on how we want to treat them. And if you don't have that information, you're not trying to populate that element, and that's how that needs to be, I guess, understood as being, it's not provided to you, not that we mean that someone shouldn't have to fast.
I thought you were going to start to talk about must support.
I'm sneaking it in. I'm sneaking it in.
Heath.
Just a clarification, it's a code.
It is a code.
Yeah, and if a doctor doesn't fill in that field about fasting, but they've ordered a glucose or an insulin or a gastrin or all of the tests which are affected by fasting state, the laboratory will ask the patient their status, so to make sure that they can put in the right code and report it properly. So it's more when the doctor has a choice of doing fasting or non-fasting, and there's a clinical reason to specifically select that condition, that he can say that.
And I can just go a little bit step further. It is actually a code to say that the precondition is fasting. All right, so this is actually a generic extension with the meaning of precondition, and the value is what is the precondition, in this case fasting. You can use the same extension for other types of preconditions.
I'm just curious, do you have another example?
Not off the top of my head, but
that's all
right.
right.
I think
I thought you might
scenarios where well, I can go have a look, see if there's a value set, but I don't think there is.
There would be for supplying whether you have to take a certain test lying down or sitting up and that type stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think imaging would have plenty of examples of where a precondition would apply.
Yeah, is pregnancy, being pregnant is a precondition for test?
Well, that's a different thing.
And antibiotic levels may be taken as a trough, before the next dose or 2 hours after the current dose. There are a lot of preconditions other than fasting that we currently have to cope with in our reporting.
Yeah, some of the other examples in the at rest or post-operative are the other examples that are provided within the precondition extension.
Yeah, I was just thinking, given if we are going to provide support for that, and if there are other meaningful preconditions that would be available at the same time, then it seems that would be reasonable to include them as well. But fasting is certainly, obviously, one of the most common. Okay, Heath, I'm assuming you're.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is there different levels of fasting, like 24 hours or 12 hours? Like, is there different, can we get quite explicit about the level of fasting?
You can, because for some tests, like a breath test for Helicobacter in the stomach, there's a minimum 4-hour fast rather than a minimum 10-hour fast. So, but they're sort of implied by the test. Again, the laboratory would check with the patient that they've fasted an adequate amount of time, but the doctor wouldn't be saying, I want you to fast 4 hours or 10 hours. They'd just be saying, I want you to fast for this test, and that implies, because the patient will get an instruction. They're not going to read the electronic message to work out there. They're going to get an instruction, usually in a piece of paper or an SMS or something that tells them how to fast. It doesn't need to be carried in the message. The laboratory knows how long they should have fasted, and they'll check that. And the patient needs to know, and that will be independent of this request, I would have thought.
Although if this starts becoming patient-centric, then this is also the instruction to the patient as well as to the lab.
Yeah, well, that's So in the sort of modern BP requesting model that we've got, whenever you request a test that requires some preparation, it'll light up on the request, and you should give that information to the patient. But here we're starting to say, well, you can give it to the patient by incorporating in the request, and you also fulfill the intention by giving that information to the laboratory.
It's interesting whether there's laboratory specific instructions.
There are slight differences, yeah, and but that's sort of part of this standardization, like FHIR and everything. They need to be harmonized as soon as we start creating generic messages.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see if we can move on. Specimen collection. I believe, Danielle, you might know this. I believe that we had a relatively limited data need from a specimen perspective.
I can talk to. So I think I believe this has come out of a couple of places. So we talked to you about scope in relation to specimen. And I think about 3 previous technical design groups, and that we all agreed that we didn't want to go through a workflow, and that was definitely out of our one, but some limited information in order to support the request around identification, and especially things about collection date time were still things that we considered to potentially be in scope for R1 because they were important. And I think that's where this list has come out of as the potential set of items that correspond to that we need to, as a technical design group, go, is that what we were thinking? Is that too many? What's missing?
Yep. And having looked through what we can get into specimen, obviously it's a lot bigger than the small set we've identified here, but there isn't any mismatch of need. I guess the other thing that'll be useful for everyone to think about at this time is thinking about what they would consider, optional, mandatory, and must support obligations around some of this information. Not that I want to resolve that here and now, but simply saying it's a good thing to keep in mind when you do look at these types of lists. All right, the next one is self-determine tests. This is actually a very deep hole that we could dig ourselves at this point in time, because the service request intent is got a number of different options that can be covered, and this includes things like self-determined tests, derived service requests. You can have, in fact, if you do go down the pathway of request groups, you can actually have a service request that is in effect bound to a group, and that it cannot carry on its own a status or a independent identity. It is only part of a group. So there's a number of quite interesting things you can do with the intent attribute, but I don't think at this point in time we would be exploring that. We do need to get a good understanding of how we want to treat service request changes and the placer changes versus the filler changes to orders and those kind of things. So that is self-determined. Rule 3 exemption. Rule 3 exemption is obviously very pathology specific. We've talked before about not requiring the eRequesting service to actually enforce any of the Rule 3 exemption constraints, simply able to carry them. So within Rule 3, there is a indication that the request that's being made is being made with Rule 3 exemption, and that associated with it will be a quantity of tests that can be performed relative to this request and the period over which those can be performed. So those all, I think, should be pretty straightforward. The interesting question is going to be how we manage the fulfillment tasks associated with Rule 3 exemption, given in theory we should be able to support the fulfillment across multiple providers for a single test request that's Rule 3 exempt.
Sorry, Andy. Third question on this. First is the occurrence period or the quantity information for Rule 3 exemption. Will that be notified or conducted by a doctor? Or each test has its own way of determining that this test has to be happened after 3 months or 6 months?
So the regulations around Rule 3 exemption are quite constrained. There are certain tests that can be subject to Rule 3 exemption, and there is a maximum time period, I believe. And the question about whether this applies to a single test or a group of tests, I'll kind of put that aside for the minute. But in my mind, the only really question about this is the fulfillment aspect. In terms of the representation, we could, for instance, make service request quantity mandatory in all service requests, and the nature of it, well, it's probably not appropriate, but you could do that and then say it was always one, defaulting to one. It could be that, or we know that there is an occurrence period that the default is, say for pathology, is 12 months from the point of order. So we could include that information, but again, it's not to say that the service itself would enforce those constraints. Simply saying that you can carry such information.
So,
because the clinician could specify that you can have, I don't know, 6 tests over a 3-month period.
Yeah. So if that information comes from clinician that we need to create 6 tests, we need to have 6 tests. So are we having 6 service requests in the system, or with just one service request and that got linked to the results?
That's a very good question, and it is an implementation option we need a position on. There are pluses and minuses to that, to either option. And it's the bit about fulfillment. If we are going to actually embed multiple fulfillments, then the service, the eRequesting service would need to be able to manage the active fulfillment. So let's say you had the request said, I want 3, then after the first fulfillment, you would only have then you would have only 2 fulfillments left. How that gets recorded and supported is a question mark. So there is a broader conversation we need to have around Rule 3 exemption.
Yeah. So my thought
Marvin.
was,
Oh, sorry, keep going.
Since the fulfillment can happen by any lab, so one service request will be challenging to have the results of different fulfillments. So if first one done by one lab, second goes to the other lab, then we need to consider all these scenarios with different fulfillments.
Yes, and it's not the way it's done today. I think others might be able to comment, but I think at the moment, from a paper perspective, it is simply photocopies of the request. And in terms of version 2 requesting, I think you would see that that's only really noted in the clinical notes, and then that's just handled manually. So we would be talking about a much more enhanced feature, but I think we've got to look at this as something that should be a generic mechanism that the existing version 2 or the existing Rule 3 exemption policy simply has a way of interpreting the appropriate information. Section 4B exemption. I know little about this other than it seems to be another extension constraint that's unique to pathology that we potentially would need to support. And I'm not, others could comment on whether it's something that is required in R1 or not. I think there's probably a much stronger argument for the Rule 3 exemptions, but again, we can look at that later. Result recipient, this is really around copies 2. The result recipient, whether what mechanism we use to support this. And I think, as Heath pointed out, I think we do need to keep in mind that places and fillers, we also have patients involved in this. So in terms of how results get communicated, there will come a time when there will be other recipients that would also need to be identified, and there are mechanisms in FHIR to do this as part of a service request specification, and therefore you need to make a decision around who is the obligated party to actually instigate the communication and deliver the result. Traditionally, in the copies 2 world, you're asking the service filler to copy a result or report. Could also be that you could actually request any other party to actually copy information as well. Or it could be that the copy 2 is actually provided by the placer themselves. Anyway, that's a discussion we need to have as well. And urgent result, again, we should probably, as Ken pointed out, map these, I think, into the generic service request, because this is not pathology specific in terms of urgent results. And hopefully everyone understands the urgent result request, simply saying that, can I provide you as a placer additional information regarding the delivery of urgent results, be it by fax, telephone, mobile, SMS, or email, whatever it is, the result be delivered to an extraordinary endpoint as opposed to the standard result delivery process that would normally happen. Service request for imaging. again, at the bottom, we've got the result delivery, which we've talked about. Laterality of body site, yes, we can certainly include that in the request itself. There is some argument to say that I don't know, you may be able to include body site alongside pathology in the pathology request, or referencing a sample being taken from a particular part of the body, arm, leg, whatever. The other issues here are more around coding, modality and contrast, and I believe that is a work in progress with the college and CSIRO. Hopefully we have a way forward in that in the next little while to at least begin prototyping. Medical device, we have a way of, the only way to carry the medical device, I believe, is through supporting information, which then is coded within supporting information. We have previously, in our previous life, talked around supporting information always having some narrative form of that data. And I think that would probably be a requirement for things like device, but nonetheless, there is a way of mapping that device information into FHIR using a minimal set of type and status, for instance. And we've already got last updated, including all resources. Supporting information, this is an ongoing discussion with the CDG. At the moment, they are suggesting we carry all supporting information as narrative, which would then likely be in clinical notes rather than supporting information. We have ways of carrying coded conditions, observations, but we need to come to a conclusion around the constraint we wish to carry in our R1 for the adoption of these kinds of data in terms of supporting implementation of diagnostic requesting. Is there anything else down there? I think that might have been the last one. Oh no. I think if you want to stop just up there, patient consent, I went through and marked this out. The reason I did that is at this stage, I don't think that there is enough background in what we would actually use patient consent for at the moment. I'm happy to look at a patient consent mechanism in supporting in the IG, but unless someone else has a really concrete use case for it, it's more difficult. We do have and have noted the withdrawal of consent for upload to my health record, which is kind of par for the course. So we know there are ways of doing that. We can put forward a proposal for that. But I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on patient consent. I'm not saying that patient consent is unimportant. I'm not saying it's not useful. I am more looking for the foundation on which patient consent directives might be founded, because the consent resource in FHIR can certainly represent a patient consent, but we would need to understand the policy or regulatory context under which that consent is being enacted or withdrawn. Yes.
Yeah,
Andrew.
I just wanted to say,
Jenny.
traditionally, the consent has been inferred from the consumer presenting for the test. And I don't think we want to make it more complicated, personally. Unless for radiology, there'll be additional consent that's needed, but for pathology, that presentation, I think that is working.
Yeah, it's a good comment. And I think certainly it's possible that as we mature, that we could seek some consent earlier in the workflow. But of course, you would need to be informed about what you're consenting to earlier in the process as well. So as you say, it all gets very complicated, I think, at that point. Andrew.
Yes, I put a note in that just because it was crossed out, and just saying that in genomics world, they do actually have some consent requirements that I think will go forward into the future, explicitly listed in the MBS requirements for some of the genomic tests, and I like a really, really upfront explicit process where a genetic counselor needs to speak to the person and written consent, and then some nuances about what they can consent to, because obviously a genomic test is a kind of test that is for life, as in it's now a record of your germline DNA forever. The implications are large, and that's why it needs genetic counseling. And then there's a whole bunch of other things where they're actually recording things like for an undiagnosed rare disease child, if they don't diagnose them in the first instance, they like to come back every year and attempt to re-diagnose the rare disease. And so you can consent to the future reinterpretation of your results. And that's a super nuanced thing. And what I'm saying there is that those choices have to flow all the way through to the path lab, who has to kind of record them in a nuanced way to do with release of data, all sorts of things like that. So I understand that's way out of scope for this round. It's out of scope for R1, R2, R3, just saying that I think their genomics might have some unique requirements around an actual consent resource and actual fields that need to get filled in and flow all the way from the requesting clinician / genetic counselor all the way to the lab.
Yes, well noted. And I think when we've got some concrete examples of that flow in play, we could certainly provide guidance around how such consent could be structured and included, and we wouldn't be restricting.
Yeah, understand. So as just noting it, and so I'm totally happy with it. As this is not obviously you crossing out is not saying that consent resources can't be attached, and I also agree. Like, they may defy any attempt to standardize for 5 years. At the moment there is no agreed upon process between the 4 places that do genomics testing as to how consent does flow through their systems. They're emailing PDFs around to each other, etc. So there is no current workflow that they actually agree upon, or what all the data items mean. So it may resist standardization for the next 5 years. So I'm not hung up on it, was just for noting.
Yeah, okay, good. Michael's raised the concept of financial consent for non-MBS tests. Yes, that's an interesting one. I don't know. We wouldn't normally be including, I think, financial consent as a foundation, but I guess, again, if we can come up with some strong examples of how such consenting is done at the moment, and whether there is a formal consent process, that would be interesting. Heath?
So I had an example of this, and basically I was asked when I went to the collection center. So again, I think we just need to be really careful that we're not overcomplicating the request side, putting more onus on the requestor when there is existing processes in place that basically, yeah, I mean, it might have been nice to have known that I would have to pay up front before I actually turned up, but I think it really comes down to the fact that the clinician is probably not going to know that is the case with the information that they have at hand at the time, because it was something that I actually asked to have done. He didn't even know what the test was. He just wrote the request, basically.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and certainly we don't overcomplicate our lives with things that aren't necessary. I guess that's why I'm for these kind of things, I'm seeking some concrete examples of where these kind of mechanisms are already kind of being overlaid, and there is an example of that formalized process done at the placer, and in this case, because that's there's a filler mechanism there, would kind of make sense. I guess some of the other ones, if we scroll up a little bit to the insurance coverage, this too is, there is the concept of representing the payer insurance information. I guess one note I wanted to make around this is, there is interesting questions here around what are you actually representing? Is this a contractual agreement around insurance coverage or payment, or is it simply an indicative kind of piece of information? And we obviously would have an easier time playing into the indicative approach rather than trying to enforce some kind of more concrete understanding of how that information should or could be used. Heath? Nope.
Sorry, that was from last time.
Okay. Marvin, did you have your hand up, or did I?
Yeah, listen, I was just going to ask, I know Rosary's on the call from SA Path. I know there is something around authority to pay and stuff like that. Is that something that you would imagine would come through in a request, or is that something that the collection center would just ask you at the time?
Well, we'd have two thoughts on that, I think. So certainly, if it's an item that is not in your Medicare benefit schedule, I think every pathology provider would want that authority to charge up front, right? So I don't know how we do that though. But yes, as we heard previously, whether it is something that each laboratory does individually is another consideration there.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think every pathology provider would be in the same spot, that if it's not a Medicare benefit scheduled item, order, test, then yes, the pathology provider would want to charge for that, because otherwise they're not getting paid for their work.
And I guess one of the things I'd come back to on this is too that at the moment we're talking about the request. If we do go down this pathway that we've I think agreed to, that there is the request and then there's fulfillment, and as part of that fulfillment, that the filler, you know, if they have been directed to be the filler for a certain test, then they at that point in time can respond with in terms of the fulfillment by effectively saying, no, I won't do this test. And that reasoning for it could be because this is not covered potentially, or it doesn't just need to be that we cannot physically do it. It's the proposed payment scheme is not supported. So that's an interesting, and again comes to if we are including insurance information, so indicating private health insurance versus MBS versus payment. How do we interpret that information? Okay, we don't, Stuart, you probably wanted some time at the end of this. So I can't remember how much. We're probably getting pretty close.
We are, yeah.
If anyone else has any issues, I guess what I'd like to bite off at this point is that service request data groups, so both the imaging and pathology and generic service request, unless anyone has any issues, because I think there were some in the pathology and imaging that were relatively generic. Those are the ones I will aim at for 2 weeks' time in terms of adding them to the scaffold as a draft way forward. And then we can have maybe a bit of a deeper conversation about some of those, and also about that grouping mechanism, which would go into that as well. Unless there are no other comments, I might just hand back to Stuart then to finish off.
Thank you very much, Andy. I have added another link just to this page as well. So if you guys do have any further comments or anything that you want to add, any sort of feedback or anything like that, please add comments to the pages in Confluence, and we will keep track of them, and we will sort of bring them up at the next meetings. So just in the interest of time, I know that people are starting to drop off. So the next couple of meetings that we have, there is the CDG and AU eRequesting and TDG joint meeting tomorrow. There will be no meeting on the 25th because that is Anzac Day. So the next AU eRequesting TDG will be on the 30th, and that will be Zoom as well. Coming up for May, so there's 4 meetings in May. They will be on the 9th, the 14th, the 23rd, and the 28th, all at 11 a.m. And as far as I'm aware, they're all the virtual conference meetings as well, or Zoom call meetings as well. Are there any further comments, or is there anything else anybody wants to add before we go?
I think we just need to confirm the agenda for the next meeting.
Sure. Yes, that would be great. Let's do that. Let me just bring up the agenda here.
Yep. So I think on the 30th, we talked about going through that, the additional feature on having a proposal around grouping and how we deal with grouping. And I think also on the agenda is to look at that meeting cadence for May and reconfirm if we do actually want this set of weekly meetings in May, or if we want to adjust the cadence. And I think what was the other things that we talked about being on the 30th? Sorry, Andy, I think there was something there at the end that we were proposing. Was it the generic service request and what that would look like in FHIR?
Yeah, so yeah, I think so. I'll aim for that as well.
Perfect. All right, I'll make sure that gets added to that table as well. So generic service request stuff will be in there ready for the 30th as well.
Talwinder has his hand up.
One of the item with respect to barcode or the token format, I think that's something also need to be finalized.
So you're proposing to bring that to our 30th of April meeting?
If we can.
Are you going to bring a proposal to the group? Is that what you're saying?
I can present what we are thinking of doing, but like also not want to understand the standard where we are moving towards. What what would be the length of the token, how they can be separated, what are the characters inside it.
I agree. It's an important issue. I just think we're probably going to be full for the 30th, so we might have to carry that over to the next meeting.
I'm sure I saw something about it in one of the Zulip streams as well. Let me see if I can dig into that and find a little bit more info on that for us to bring something to the meeting after the 30th.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, I haven't got it directly in front of me. I'll have a dig around. I know that there was a couple of people talking about that. It might have been Angus and a couple of other guys as well. So let me see what I can find for that one too. Cool.
Ask, is it on the, I think it's on the additional features too. So that would be a good thing for to vote on if you haven't already, Talinda, so we can prioritize that, I guess, in the list of things we work on.
Yep, definitely upvote that.
For sure. Awesome. Anything else, Talwinder?
Okay.
All right. Does anybody have anything else they want to raise? Nope, nothing in the chat. Seems all good. So if everybody's happy, then I think we can end the meeting there. Danielle, is there anything you want to add further?
No, thank you.
Perfect. All right, then we will end the meeting there, and we got all the minutes and action items updated on those tables, Confluence pages, and emailed out to everybody.
Thank
you all for coming.
Thanks, Stuart. Good job.
Thanks, Stuart. Great sharing.
Thank you.
Before it starts showing up.